everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock. I am the panel host, once again, Mackenzie, also General Assistant at Cup of Hemlock, and we are joined by our OG panel today, all the way back in King Lear days when we first started this fun little adventure. We had all four of us together, and now we're back again after having some fantastic guests appear. So we're going to start things off again, once again, with Jill, our friend of the company, special guest of the day.
Hello,
Jill,
everyone.
hello. Welcome back.
Hello.
This is now, how many episodes have you done with us?
This is my 4th episode.
Correct, that's right. You've only missed the Tempest so far.
Yes.
It's the only one you've missed out of all of them.
Correct.
And what is in your cup today?
So, of course, I have to start with my whole ensemble on
Very
theme. So I decided to dress as a guest of Timon's. So I'm wearing sort of a glittery-esque top. I have a pencil skirt on underneath for effect. I have these little hoop earrings. Hair is kind of a hybrid of Grecian look, but mixed with the female work attire style hair that is seen in this production.
Very good.
And then in my cup, I have a cup of white wine tonight.
Ah.
I wanted champagne, but quarantine times, white wine was the only thing I had in my house at the time. So, cheers.
Fair enough. Next, we have our resident dramaturg, literary manager, Mr. Ryan Borochovitz. Ryan, how are ya?
I'm doing well, Mac. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, anytime. You've also appeared on
4
how many
episodes.
Four
the only
episodes.
one that I have not been on was Macker's, because I was very happy to make room for our special guest panelist, Bridget Wilson.
Correct.
But I've been on every other episode so far.
Yes,
including
very
this
true.
one now.
And what is in your cup today?
I'm going back, since it's the OG panel, back to my OG green coffee mug with orange pekoe tea.
Ah, very good, very good. And last but certainly not least, we have our production manager of Cup of Hemlock, Mr. Edmond Clark. Ed, how you doing today? Welcome back.
I'm doing so well. It's so good to be back. I feel like more of a guest than Jillian. I think I missed how many episodes? 2?
Yes.
So in my cup is water, as always, spicing it up. But this is a Blockbuster mug that I
Loving
found,
that.
and it just made me think about all the good times when you had to go out of your way in person to buy DVDs. And
Rent.
now Netflix.
No.
And
I know.
Also,
that's a piece of history right there.
Also, I think it's
is.
on theme because, much like Blockbuster, Timon is also out of business, feels obsolete in this new ever-changing world because he couldn't keep his finances up to date.
Ryan took every single word right out of my head.
Perfect. And I am back to my silver tankard once again, and I also am drinking water, as I felt it was very appropriate with Timon's party in the show where he serves everybody a bowl of water.
Yes. You may see me also drinking from a bottle, so nods up to Epimantis, bottle of water in this production. So I did have water as well.
Very true. And so today, in case you didn't read the title or the description on our YouTube page, we will be covering the Stratford Festival production of Timon of Athens, directed by Stephen Ouimette, who we've seen in a number of these shows already. From, what do we have him in? We had him in Lear, we had him in Coriolanus, we had him in The Tempest.
He was not in Macbeth, much like myself.
He was not in Macker's. he was not in Macker's, but he's directing this week, which is very nice to see his directorial efforts, because he is one of the directors at Stratford, and he also runs the Birmingham Conservatory there. So quite a well-rounded man, and this is his production that he did at the now demolished Tom Patterson Theatre, which they've now been rebuilding. Because in the winters it was like a hockey rink, and then in the summers it was a theater. So this was the production that was filmed in the old Tom Patterson.
Nice.
So there we go. So once again, a little bit of history. Also,
obsolescence and the destruction of the old.
Yeah,
there you go.
Retreating into its cave.
Yes, exactly.
Literally digging up the stage.
Ah, look at that. So many wonderful little
We have fun.
We do. Okay, so why don't we kick things off, as we do on this panel, with who was our best performed character of the show. Ed, why don't we start with you this time?
Oh, goody. I think, and maybe I'm wrong. I'll speak for everybody right now. I think Apomantus was my
Snap.
Yes.
Was
Ben
that
Carlson is
Don't worry,
Apomantus.
I have a backup because I knew if anyone goes before me, they would probably say him. So don't worry, you're fine.
Smart. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it's just a funny written character.
Yes.
Just the dialogue is just so clever and so quick, and his delivery of it was pretty spot on. So it was good. There were some moments for me that the attitude became a bit, I guess consistent. There wasn't too much differentiation from the delivery, but for the most part, I did enjoy everything, and I could understand everything that he was saying. So
exactly.
I have to give it to Apomantus. My cups for Apomantus.
Like, that's just such a fun character. Like, even like reading the text, just like the description of him next to his name and the dramatis personae list is just the churlish philosopher, and that's, I think, sums him up very well. He has that churlishness to him, very much like a Diogenes type of figure. And I really like the take that they took on with him, as he is like a contemporary philosophy professor type, very much like hipster-esque in his suit. He reminds me an awful lot of, I don't recall the actor's name, who played Gail Bedecker in Breaking Bad.
Kind of looks like John Green to me from
like the novelist and star.
He melted really well into this adaptation too. Like, him modernizing this character was wonderful. He was still really grounded in the text itself, but then kind of had a swankiness to it that I think modern audiences can relate to that character really well, especially with this text being very rarely read and or performed. That was a great counterpart with Joseph's Timon too. I felt they played off each other really well.
One of my favorite little bits of staging here was in like the mask scene that was reconceptualized as like a stripper party here, where he's just reading his book and the strippers are taking it and he's mad at them.
Yeah, that was pretty
like
funny.
I feel so seen.
I did think for a brief minute when he took off his blazer that they were going to dance on him. That's what I thought. But I did like the book that he pulled out. That was
Ben Carlson, he is wonderful. He is one of the many stock actors at Stratford who has done so many things. I mean, we're going to see him again in Taming of the Shrew, as they talked about in the cast reunion video. Like, he's played Hamlet. He's done Captain Von Trapp. He was a very good Feste, which this performance reminded me a lot of his Feste when he did Twelfth Night. That same kind of really dry-witted performance that he does. And we'll also be seeing him in Merry Wives. He plays Pastor Hugh, the Welsh priest.
Oh, exciting. Looking forward to that.
Yes, he's very good. Ben Carlson is one of those great actors of Stratford, and you know when he's going to be in a show, you're just in for a special treat of a performance. Yeah. So, Ryan, you mentioned you had a backup just in case Apomantus was snagged. So who's yours?
I figured it would be. Okay, so this is more of an unconventional choice that I will explain. But I will say my pick, if Ben Carlson's taken, is Michaela Davies as the third stranger. So let me explain for a minute. So something that really strikes me about this play is that there are a lot of characters in it, many of whom don't have proper names, and many of the ones that do are very interchangeable. Like, there's always just there's like so many of like Timon's servants and Timon's creditors, and like the servants of his creditors, and the lords and the senators, and a lot of these interchangeable characters that I think, like, if I was, if I didn't have Stratford's budget and I was directing a production of this play, I would condense each one of those into one character apiece. But Michaela Davies, who is credited as third stranger here, was one of the creditor servants who came to mob Timon with the requests for due payment. And she was in most of those scenes. She was the only female one. She was wearing with the orange collar and necktie. I like how they were all differentiated by the same costume, but different collar and necktie. And like my main reason for picking her out in general is I've been following her career for a little while in Toronto. She was in the Soul Pepper Academy. I've seen her do many productions in there. She was wonderful in a play called The Thirst of Hearts, which is an adaptation of my favorite novel, which is War and Peace, where she played Natasha. So when I was kind of taken aback when I saw her here, and it stood out like, oh, I've seen her in things. It's so great to see her moving on up to the Stratford stage, and I think that is worthy of a special shout out, especially since Ed took Appomattox right out of the
Yeah.
Very good.
Tip my
Very
cup
good.
to Michaela Davies and the rest of those younger company members who deserve their special
Quite a
debut.
few Yorkies in the show. I mean, you had
Oh,
Josh,
really?
you had Emilio, who were both in there, who were both
Which
graduates.
one was Emilio? Because I've heard so much about Emilio.
He was also in The Tempest last week as Adrian, I believe.
He was in The Tempest, and he was Malcolm in Mackers as well. So so Emilio's done quite a few. We'll have to try and get him on for a panel. I feel like he'd be a wonderful person to have in there. So we'll definitely have to reach out to him for that. But yes, wonderful. Okay, Jill, who are you giving your cup to today?
So Appomattox was my cheers, hear ye, but I will do the same thing as Ryan. I have a second choice, but he's certainly not second rate by any means. He has been such a staple for me over all of these productions we've watched thus far is David Collins. I gotta just chuck one up for him.
I did that last week. I gave him that special shout out.
He's such a chameleon. He's one of those actors that you know in every scene that he's in and every show that he's in, he can play opposite sides of the spectrum and just slay everything. His voice is so unique to his gestures. Even I focused a lot more on his facial expression during this recording because we'll probably get to this, but the filming of this was super neat for me too and different than the other films we've watched thus far. And so just honing in more on his facial expressions are so unique as well. He's a diamond for me. So
he's the only person who's been in all 5 productions we've reviewed so far.
Yeah, he is consistent.
Just cheers to David Collins.
Very good. Cheers to David Collins. Very well said on that front.
I'm glad I went first because I did not have a second. I knew Appomattox was really served me up one, Matt.
I do. I actually do. And it is Michael Spencer Davis as Flavius.
Yeah.
Flavius or Flavius?
I think it's Flavius.
Flavius.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's so many names. Yeah, there's so many names that sound very similar in this play, in true Shakespearean fashion. But yes, him. He plays kind of the stewardy butler character to Timon. And I liked it because he played it with such sincerity. Like there was just such you could feel his dedication to this man. That even when he can't pay a Flavius anymore, like he still is there. Like there's the scene where he's standing over the hole, and yet there's a whole other scene going on, and you just see him in the background, just playing guardian to this man who has lost his mind in a hole.
I have to agree with you that Flavius was really well done. And if I can point out just one moment that really stuck with me, it's in Act 4, Scene 2. It's when Flavius is telling the rest of the servants that, Timon is gone. We have to, go spread our separate ways or go find him. And there's a stage direction in the text that's the servants embrace and go their separate ways. That there was one just really tender moment where they're about to leave, and one of them, I think it might have been Flaminius, actually stops, turns around, and gives Flavius just a really tender hug. To take that stage direction and really do something moving with it, I thought was really a testament to both of those performers. And the directing, of course, has a lot to do with that.
And I just want to piggyback on that, where what's neat about the Flavius relationship with Timon is it highlights the class within this world. And it's the thing where all these time periods, like if you watch Downton Abbey, where you have that kind of upstairs downstairs routine with Carson and what's his name, the head of the house, the father figure.
I don't watch the show.
Yes, I do. I know exactly who you're talking about. Yes.
You're right? Him, the dad. But it's that same type of relationship where they're back and forth with each other, and they're friends. It's almost like Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings too, where it's that master-servant thing where they go beyond that and now they are friends, and but at the same time they have that weird class thing where you, at the beginning, where you see them talking about the bank accounts, and he's saying, if you're accusing me of something, then go take me to court. Like there's that real kind of push and pull with them, and they really played off each other really nicely. Joseph Ziegler and Michael Spencer Davis. It's almost like the Fool and Lear, very similar relationship with each other, and it's really nice. So yes, but you were going to add something on to the
I was just going to add, I had written down in my notes too. I also super admired the way that character was fleshed out, but a question I guess to pose to all of us is, do you think that character could have been played on a more serious tone? Now we do have Epaminondas sort of acting as the rational, you would assume, friend of Timon's as well, a long had friend of Timon's, but with I guess with the idea that there's the three other servants of Timon's, could you play Flavius as having a bit more like annoyance towards Timon neglecting his, like a bit more attitude? Yeah, like
you could.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could directorially make him that, but I think that takes away from who Flavius is. Where Flavius, because of the fact that he says, "I've told you multiple times, watch your money, watch your finances." But if he's too aggressive or like too outspoken, then it's like, okay, well, why didn't Timon listen? But it's the fact that he's a little bit more of a soft-spoken character. And it's like, oh, well, that's why Timon can overlook him and kind of push him off.
The more we talk about it too, Epaminondas is already kind of there as that rational, grounded facet of Timon.
I also kind of think like Epaminondas is such a Debbie Downer all the time that even though like he's right about most of the stuff, it's so easy to not listen to him. And then Flavius is like a very timid. He almost like reminded me of like Pooh Bear, like
or like a little puppy dog or something.
So like it doesn't surprise me at all that Timon doesn't listen to him.
I agree with Mac. I think he, like, how he played it and how he contrasted against the others who were taking or who had adopted that more serious those more serious undertones or sarcastic undertones, where it even plays into the line that Timon says towards the latter half of the play, where he goes, he's the only honest man, right? And I think it's because Flavius has just always been so tender when it comes to Timon.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great.
Well, there we go.
Good choice, Mac.
Yes, a cup raised to Michael Spencer Davis.
Cup raise.
Very good. Okay. All right, now we get into the part where we talk about the characters who we don't feel were represented as well. And I actually want to kick this one off because I got a feeling it will spawn a lot of conversation. I have to say Joseph Ziegler.
I was going to say the same thing.
I was going to say the same thing.
Oh, really?
I was not.
Okay.
We probably contribute.
I mean, don't get me wrong. He's a wonderful actor. I mean, we've watched him in many great performances, whether it's at Soul Pepper or at Stratford. But what I found became the challenge of Timon, and I've seen this now twice. I saw it at the movie theaters when they first screened it, and I hadn't seen it at Stratford. I was only seeing it on the big screen, and then I saw it again. And both times I was like, first part he does really well, where he's playing this multi-leveled performance, but then after he does his Athenian angry speech and storms off, and then he's in the hole the rest of the show, it's all one level with him. There's very little change in his voice or his emotions, and then it becomes kind of flat. It becomes kind of like, you're just now yelling at me a lot. And Timon, I guess for Matt, it's like, go watch Comfiore's King Lear when in his madness scene, where yes, he's yelling at some times, but then other times he's very soft.
However, two very, very different characters, which
Lear is softer overall, I would agree, but I still think there was room for more nuance, especially in the latter half of the performance. My big concern and why I put him on my list, and actually didn't come prepared with the second choice, so I'm glad we're all kind of preparing this out in agreement. I agree. I think he's wonderful, and I really did love the first half where he is like, benevolent, not a care in the world, and even like when he's like, I love the funny scene where he's like shaving with like his like towel on when the creditors bombard him.
Right. With his swing razor.
Yeah.
But the thing that really kind of like not even irked me, I was very concerned for his vocal cords the whole time. And that took me out of the performance, not because he was yelling, but just because like his tone of voice was very raspy. He was like, he felt like very like, I don't know if it just was like a lack of vocal warm up or he wasn't on the lift enough. But
to add on to Ryan, and I agree with both Ryan and Mac heavily. So just so everybody knows, I don't know if I didn't state this in my past videos, but I have over 11 years of theater performance experience. In my last 3 years has been focused intensely on voice. And I put it to the side that during the first half of the performance, before he starts to realize that he's in a room full of cutthroats and people that don't have his back, up until that point, I was like, okay, it's not horrible. There's nothing that stands out that I would say, okay, this is my least favorite. But yeah, going on what Max said, after that, once he did have his explosion, it stayed explosive, and his voice was very limited. The speaking from the throat, the raspiness, I mean, it was from the beginning of the play, but once he reached that peak, he tried to stay at that peak, and there was none of that nuance to help go back down and raise himself back up. How I like to look at Shakespeare, especially and I think I said it in one of the other videos, I think it was with Coriolanus, how those lead roles can often be traps where if you see a powerful character, usually people play them powerfully all the time, but powerful characters don't need to play powerful if they know that they are powerful. And one analogy that I give with Shakespeare text is that because it's so full of images and different phrases, and like a outline of a coloring book with a house, right? You don't color the sky, the grass, the house, the window, the doors, all red. Right. So that was my I heavily agree with Ryan. Right, like the biggest thing is that the voice took me out of it, and then with Mac, it just stayed there till the end.
See, I think 2 weeks. Sorry, Mac, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure, of course. No, I was going to piggyback off that, where I think when we talked about this in Lear with Comfior, where and you're talking about how the biggest voice moment for Lear should be the storm, and then after that we should see a drop in the voice. And I feel that's the same way with Timon, where Timon's biggest voice moment should be at the end of that moment where he's yelling at the walls of Athens and he's cursing them. And then throughout his time in the hole, we should see the man becoming weaker and weaker, because he's living off roots and water, which would physically just make you sun rashes, your heat stroke. Like you should be we should see that progression of
more weakness.
Exactly.
I will say, as a subtle defense to him, if I were to dramaturgically dissect why perhaps it became one tone and or one volume, is because the way he was communicating with people, the way he spoke, the life he lived, completely gets kiboshed, and he is now alone, trapped. We see him in the same location, exhausted, at wit's ends. Like most of the latter half of his dialogue is just him cursing, or long strands of basically, I was going to say a swear word, but I can't do that. Hating humanity in a sense that he can't understand their, it's just there's the lack of communication that happens. So yes, I do agree. Like from an actor's perspective, vocally, 100%. There were times where I was a little on edge of, are you healthy? Are you doing that okay? But I don't think it was done unjustified. If that makes sense.
What Jill, I think what I'm
could
hearing
play
kind of in what you're saying is, like, if we're going to make the Lear comparisons, which I know is easy to do with this play, and we have a whole discussion question planned for that later. So, but I think what strikes me as the difference here is that with Lear, and especially with Comfior's portrayal that we saw a few weeks ago, I definitely believe that Lear has had this complete change of status and has gone mad and has undergone this change. Whereas with Timon, and perhaps this was a deliberate acting or directing choice, I don't know, but to me it felt like the second half of the play was Timon impersonating what he thinks a madman looks like, more so than I actually feel like he became mad. And I think that is the stark contrast.
Interesting.
Maybe that was the plan all along. Hard to say.
I would say that's a pretty interesting choice. If they were to be going with that.
I mean, you never could direct it like he's doing that, where he's doing the, hey, when people come by my hole, I'm going to play mad just so they leave me alone. And then the rest of the time it's, okay, I'm just here digging my hole.
Yeah. Well, if they were to be going with that, I think the scene with Epamantis and him plays pretty well, where he's kind of telling him, hey man, you don't need to be doing this. You don't need to be digging a hole. And to go off of what Jillian was saying, to argue with that, I think it would have been interesting. Because I get it, he was backed into a corner. This is probably the only form of communication he can have. But I think would have been a really interesting choice, and this comes more directorially, is if he adopted the persona or the tones, moods, or however you want to say, the rhythm of Epamantis, and Epamantis adopted his Timon's from when he was in the beginning.
So Jill, who is your other person?
Yeah, so just small, because overall I thought all the characters were done very well, and they were all justified, especially this being a piece that's not performed often. There really wasn't much to compare to or contrast to, rather. So this, I don't think, was the actor's fault by any means. Quite possibly, maybe directorially this was, but Tim Campbell as our Alcibiades.
Which one was that?
He's the military leader, the general.
Oh, okay.
He's the one at the end that, calls the shots with the bombings and stuff.
Yes.
So I just wanted to see, again, it had nothing to do with the actor. I think this is coming from it directorially, but just at the beginning, I wanted to see more of a presence with his character, even though I know it's very B-plot to what we're actually supposed to be focusing on. But near the end, I thought he really took charge and held ground, and I actually got goosebumps from his performance. So tops to that. But I felt that could have grown a bit more than it did, especially because with this interpretation, he was such a heavy presence at the end. I was a little bit taken out of, I didn't necessarily trust that this character was doing what he was doing, because I wanted to know more about him earlier on. And again, I don't know if that would be a directorial thing, or quite possibly maybe there's another letter to be sent to Shakespeare to a line of, give me more of him. But
I think because I agree with you, I think what could have probably helped, technically speaking, with as a performer, what could have happened is to speak slower and to speak with more precision. He is a military man, so it would make sense. He doesn't have as many lines as most characters, so when you hear him speak, it won't always feel like he's speaking so slow. But somebody who takes their time when they speak, because in this whole thing, and I'll speak about it more later, but it's very dialogue driven, and so many people talk fast, and like in a room of senators, they talk fast, arguing and bantering upon one another. I think that's just one way that this is my actor brain speaking. He could have stood out, where, okay, this guy takes his time. This guy is this he's already, like, just his physical frame is already his position imposing.
Even too, soldier versus senator.
Yeah. So it would have been cool to see a senator go da, 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 and go right. That's just.
So what I think is interesting about that character is he's essentially living out the plot of Coriolanus in a B plot in this play.
Exactly.
He's given reason to turn against his home, the city of Athens, and then, revolts against it. And, but because, he doesn't have the Coriolanus worth of character development, that it really just, seems to come out of nowhere when suddenly, the end of the play is almost all about him.
I will say, though, what's the actor's name again, Jill?
Tim Campbell.
Tim Campbell,
Tim Campbell. I will say he looks like a military man, like that big,
100%.
Especially in the first one where he's in the uniform. Like, he just came in and I was like, oh, you totally look like my classic Hollywood, like, military man. Like, someone needs to swoop him up and, like,
all of our military men thus far. Graham Abbey, Andre Sills, like, cheers to the...
Cheers to military.
They need to do a production of Titus with those three men, I have to say. Get those three men in a production of Titus, they would kill it.
Ooh,
for sure.
No pun intended.
Aha!
A lot of killing in that play.
That's very good. Yes, very true. Okay. All right, now we get on to our favorite production element. And Ryan, I want you to kick us off this time for this question. What is your favorite production element?
So I already kind of started getting into it when I talked about the colors and ties, but I loved the costumes in this production. And I loved a lot of like the small details of the costumes, like the fact that all the different creditor servants had the exact same outfit but different colors and ties. One of my favorite tiny details, and it's like a blink if you miss it thing. But speaking of Alcibiades, before he defects, when he's in his military uniform, it has the contemporary Greek flag.
Yes.
Nice. Yes.
I'm like, that's just such a fun detail that is like not important, but somebody put thought into that, and I'm just like a sucker for that stuff, especially if you're going to do like the contemporary reimagining. It's nice that you actually take that to its logical conclusion, like it's Athens, therefore let's do the modern Greek flag.
To subtly add on that too, Ryan, the dresses of the female dancers, it was very Grecian, and even the whole dance was sort of choreographed, but also modernized.
Because they're the Amazons. Like in the text, that whole scene is a mask, so to speak, mask with a Q, like a courtly performance. And I think it's very kind of clever to turn that into, okay, these are like businessmen, turn it into a bit of a like stripper party kind of thing.
But even so, like making it sort of rooted in Grecian attire and the dance alone, it almost seems like a modern themed party, you know?
Those
like
characters
are like stripper or something
Amazons.
Toga.
There's supposed to be Amazons, which I don't think there's like a line of text that said it. It's just in the stage directions. It's cute.
Yeah, there's no line of text that says what they are. They just says that there's a present for Timon. And they bring in these people for a mask party.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like of course, and then speaking of costumes, like Timon's hobo suit in the whole latter half of the play, especially we talked about the sun scabs, and like it's just like considering how classy and dapper he looked in the first half, just to like see that transformation, even if the acting, as we discussed, didn't necessarily like meet up to the task. I think the costume alone is just beautiful to look at in how grotesque it is,
and it played into the like degradation of man too. You know, each element got grittier and grittier as the show went on.
I loved his dirty suspenders on that costume. I was like, that's such a nice detail. There
was a moment though I was like, I just want to pull him up. Like they're sagging a little bit. I just want to fix you, Timon. Like
I like when he's just tapping on when he finds the gold, and he's just tapping on it, like, what's this? After he just finished like yelling at the gods, and then he looks down and goes, oh, what's this?
I want a root, not gold. God damn it, gods.
Right.
Very true. Very true.
That's my
Jill, very good. The costumes.
So great segue, because that was a close second for me, costumes. But along the same lines, I have to say set was my favorite design element. All of them, I think, played really well. Like all of the design elements was the perfect cherry on top to this performance. But set for sure, because I thought it was so simple, yet so effective. Like Ryan was saying, the little details of furniture placement, talking back to the Grecian sort of nod, the senator's desk had that sort of modern, swanky black marble, but then the column legs, you know, and and then even just talking in the scenes with the Timon, the way that they dug up the stage per se, that image to me was so visceral. And I thought it played into, similar to the costume, it played into, you know, the destruction of Timon, the destruction of man, and literally trying to get to the root of the play, the root of the stage, you know? So there was, I had a dramaturgical heyday with this.
I will say, no, Ryan, you go first.
Well, also just like while we're talking about the set, theater in the round is very difficult to stage around, so like in the set everything has to like correspond with that, so they made great use of it. And the fact that we're watching it as a film, we have the luxury of like spinning around and seeing it from different angles, but the fact that it has to make sense to every single audience member regardless of which of the four sides.
Play even more into that, the chairs used for the banquet sequences were see-through, and to me that also had so many meanings. I thought of that too, Ryan. I was like, oh my God, these chairs, it's one less object in the across audience members' view. They can look right through the chair. And it also played into, you know, a lot of people sitting in these chairs, you can see right through them. They're fake, right? They're, so, you know, and even the banquet sequence alone, the idea of sort of staging the cutlery and everything is very black and white. Again, that played into the fact that a lot of these characters in this play see things as very black and white, right or wrong, which contrasts to me Timon's whole ideal of exuberance and having a bit more of a colorful way of thinking of humanity. So there's the detailing into every set piece, and I'll say it props even too, if we go into the 3 households that the servants go into as well, like the iPhone, the VR, like virtual reality component, and the iPad,
the stock market.
3 different, the 3 different modern props. You could have made it not even apparent, but the fact that you did, it sort of played into so many other themes and motifs that we'll get to later too. But just nothing on the set to me I questioned.
So I will say that unfortunately set made my other list.
And
it made my list not because it was bad, but I just felt, because if you for people who will never be able to see the old Tom Patterson Theater, but it's a very long alley thrust stage with very limited storage in the back for the show. So that's why when you see any show with Tom Patterson, there was very limited set to what they could do, and this kind of stuck with that theme. And I just felt, out of all the pieces, I was like, this is like, there just wasn't a lot of it to discuss, or get into. So I was like, okay, like it's nice they mixed the modern and the Greek with like the desk with the columns underneath it. I was like, that's nice, and the stage opened up, which was the coolest effect of the set. And I was like, out of all those production elements, I was like, that's not my strongest or favorite element of them. I mean, it wasn't a bad thing. I mean, Stephen did a very good job with his production team of working with what he had. I just think the Tom Patterson has never really lent itself in its old formation to giving us a great set, kind of like what we saw with the festival stage with the Tempest, where we had that beautiful tree.
The set was my favorite element of it.
Very good.
I really like the modernization of Athens.
Yes.
And it just plays into that costume piece as well with the Greek flag, but the the marble that they're walking on, the desk, as Jillian pointed out, the chairs, the lounge seats. There was something else that was really cool about the set too. I can't remember. The lighting against the set was usually I'm not always for modernization piece or like modern pieces with like, or modern takes with Shakespeare, but like I really did like this one. I really did like the set. I don't have really too many complaints about the production aspects. I would say like I'm battling between lighting and costume.
I have lighting on my favorite list, so
I have lighting or costume on my not favorite. But like it's not that it's bad. It's just if we're going by least, then my like with the costumes, I thought there could have been a bit more distinguishing looks between the servants and the debt collectors, like the assistants from the senators. And I mean, you could maybe a little bit more of a distinction between the senators as well, but like it's not anything too big, and like it's there. It's just I'm just being greedy. And then the lighting was very like just kind of flush. And is that right? Am I using that right term? Flush? I'm not a lighting guy.
Wash, like a wash.
Wash. Yeah, the lighting was just very washed, but I really liked it with especially when they were indoors and when they were in the club. There was just one. I thought, maybe this would be kind of cool if they did it like a green light instead of a blue light when they reach the senators' rooms or when they're at the table, because it just kind of plays into the green for greed within Shakespeare's own text and Iago. That's like it's
well, I will say that lighting did make my standout list, because I felt the lighting really kind of pulled everything together, because it was such a limited set. The lighting really added that element, like with that dry heat, with that orangey red and that moon, that nice, beautiful moon they had there.
That circular fixture that we were always taken to, and especially because the filming of it, basically that set the mood for everything for us, right? Us being the virtual viewers. I thought that was an awesome
It's great.
add too.
It's great. I mean, like that dry heat of Act 2, you just felt with those lights, and also had a great passage. It felt sticky. It felt hot. And it also just felt that great passage of time with like that. They were really great with that, with the changing of the lights, where like night versus day, and you got to see that progression of time. But then even during Act 1, where they talk about how like the water, it's blue, it's flowing, like the money is flowing, so it's that nice, rich color blue.
Timon is sort of having hallucinations or elusive dreaming too. The sort of dumbing down the lights and having almost like apparitions pass. I thought that was a neat way of doing it, especially in the round. I feel like that would be kind of tricky to
and symbolically with like going from night to day. Timon is, you know, the dark. You don't really see too far, right? And then the sun is revealing, and he's under the sun, under the beating sun as it gets hotter and hotter. So you know, the eye watching.
And I will say the battle scene with the lighting was so great, and it reminded me of a very modern thing we used to have, which was the invasion of Iraq. Where when you watch the news shots of like those nighttime shots of them firing the missiles to Iraq and starting to blow it all up and starting the invasion there, I was like, oh, Stephen Ouimette, you brilliant man.
And I kind of admired, I liked that he added strobe effect for that as opposed to the party scene.
Yes.
I really liked the lighting for the party scene, I found, because there was so much going on actively with and little things. I mean, I can't imagine. I feel like it would be even more overwhelming seeing it in the theater, because you have so many different ways to look. Whereas again, our view was kind of more scoped. So we were able to see Epamantis throw his book, but we weren't able to see what all the other lords were doing per se. But I think if they added strobe lighting, especially sitting in the audience in that scene, it kind of fully would have gone over our heads. And then it would have been icky to kind of use that same effect with the bombing effect at the end too. So
that would imply that this party is just like a war.
Well, which arguably I guess
enjoying it.
you could say that too. It does stem a lot.
It would be
of
a choice that would to be made, but I think you're right. It's better that they save the strobe just for that wow moment at the end. And like you said, Mac, it was very evocative of something that we frequently see fetishized on the news of certain missile attacks and bombings. So yeah, I was very pleased with that sequence as a spectator, not knowing that it's not actually a real war bombing.
And also the battle scene reminded me of something Bridget talked about in Mackers, where they did the whole flay-on scene in the Vom, and then had the rest of and had the rest of the action in the dark, setting up for the banquet moment. And it's very similar to this, where like you have I forget the general. What's his name?
Alcibiades.
Alcibiades standing up in the audience there talking, and they're bombing. But then on stage, you know what they're really doing is they're closing up that hole, Timon's hole, and clearing the stage basically of all that stuff. Which is
it's kind of talking about what we talked with Macker's Mac of it being choosing what violence to show and what violence not to show. So
and the fact that when the lights come up, you just have all these bodies strewn across the stage. I was like, oh, that's such a great moment. And my honorable shout out is the makeup, which is something that Stratford doesn't do very often. I mean, like we saw it with Mackers with the Banquo wounds, but with this, speaking as a ginger.
Tempest.
Into the Tempest. But speaking as a ginger who has had many a blistering sunburn experience. See, there you go, Jill.
Literally on the shoulders.
Exactly. And just watching that skin blister, it just made my skin crawl, because I was like,
yeah, they're doing it really well. They're really showing it.
Timon, like, I know exactly that pain you are feeling with that heat of that sunburn on you. I was like, makeup, great job of making Timon look beaten and miserable.
I wanted to just throw him a big baggy pool t-shirt, and I was like, here you go, Timon, that's your wardrobe for the rest of the season.
I was like, Timon, get some aloe, buddy. Ask somebody to get you some aloe. You got some gold there. Go buy some aloe. Rub that on your shoulders.
Who needs an apple? I need aloe, Epamantis. Exactly. I don't need an apple.
Exactly. But yes. So Ryan, what was the production one that didn't quite work for you?
Like overall, before I'll preface what I'm about to say with, I liked most of it. Like I really can't complain. So that's why I'm forced to pick something very nitpicky, like very nitpicky. I have to preface it with that, just so you don't think, oh, that's nitpicky. Like I know, but I had to think of something for this question, and like, so it falls within props, and that it's in the VR scene, the one where it's in Act 3, Scene 2, and it's where they come to the Lord or the Senator who has his fancy VR setup and
swimming with whales. Yeah,
and I don't take issue with the VR. That's fine. It was a clever choice. I'm all for it. But then after the main conversationalists or interlocutors of the scene leave, and it's the two female servants remaining.
Oh
no, okay, yeah. So I thought this was really clever at first. When the line was, I have the line here. It's like, do you observe this? Hostile, yeah, I can't say the character's name, but do you observe this? And I too well. And she showed her phone, and they were recording the whole conversation. And I think that. So my first thought was, that is so clever, because to observe something in this contemporary setting, back then it would have been did you take note of this so we can do something with it later? Are you the witness? And that is the contemporary way of witnessing. My problem is that great idea feels wasted in that moment, because nothing ever comes of that later. The observing that encounter, getting it recorded.
I'm gonna jump on Ryan's bandwagon.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about this?
No. I just agree with you. I agree with you.
I have a very hard time. I'm almost more forgiving of bad ideas, so to speak, than very good ideas that are squandered in this way.
I will debate this whole convo, I think, because I think it's very indicative, especially because I think this production isn't necessarily sheerly modern. I think it's similar to what our Coriolanus was, where it could be post-apocalyptic, in regards to these three households. The costuming is similar, but also astronomically different. I'm not sure exactly what year, every scene is potentially taking place in. So if, though, we are to kind of use that specific scenario as being the modern way of observing something, of recording something, I guess personally I can relate. There's so many things in my life that I've taken a picture of or have recorded or whatever that never gets brought to fruition. I never posted anywhere. I never shared anywhere.
That's my answer to that is, that's in life, but in theater we have a thing called Chekhov's gun, and when you introduce a detail it has to fire sometime in Act 2.
I was gonna say.
So,
but I think this play challenges a lot of stuff like that too, and I think we'll get into that when we have further questions about that. But I think it can be posed as a challenger if we were to justify why it was. I
opened this point with, it's very nitpicky and it doesn't make or break anything. It's just, if you're asking one thing that I was disappointed with, I think if you're going to do a really cool idea with that, I would have loved to see it pay off somehow, or maybe save that for another play where witness testimony is more important, like Much Ado About Nothing, where that could have something like that brought up when we're talking about witnessing hero in an unfaithful act. There's a lot of Shakespeare plays where witness testimony is important, and I felt to use that idea on this one felt like a missed opportunity, or missed opportunity to not use it better elsewhere, I guess.
Maybe she accidentally deletes it.
Maybe, but then why?
Or I will say, it could be commenting the fact that we film things like that, but then when we don't post them, it's almost like them not taking enough care for Timon, where it's
Again, it's just another element of excess, I think, too, that this play presents. It's a bunch of extra stuff that's happening on the stage, quite honestly, too, making the whole transition of music listening that long, you're made to sit through, the changing levels of music. So it could add to just another element of excess nonsense that Timon hits on, that much of humanity dabbles in, and that's almost seems like their priority versus genuine relationships with each other, But again, we probably unpack that further down the line.
I feel like we could certainly come up with any number of good explanations, but I think maybe that's giving it a little too much credit. And again, not a big deal, such a minor thing I've chose to talk about here. Otherwise,
no things minor. We will bring them to the table.
There are no minor instances.
And overall, I'm saying it was a good, clever idea. I just feel like it wasn't used to its best potential is all.
Right.
Fair enough. Jill, is there anything on the production that you felt could have been.
This is the weakest part of the
Correct.
weakest part of the yeah. So
Yes.
again, like I've said with characters and the set and everything too, nothing really stood out as being off or weak I thought it was very clean, tight production overall. One thing I just kind of would maybe want a little bit more of, or quite possibly stage it differently, is the bantering that goes on with Timon and Apamantis. And in this, I'm saying I kind of wanted it to be more animalistic as opposed to comedic, because I feel like that was a moment of the play where both characters could sort of blow up within themselves and at each other. And there was a wonderful, and again, I didn't even know we were going to bring this up, but talking to this piece potentially breaking the rules, or, you know, in a theatrical way. They were doing a very good job actorially of making sure all audience members at least have a perspective of one of the other's faces and gestures. But I kind of wanted them to not. I wanted them to get closer and maybe only be looking a certain direction. I just wanted that conversation to be very avant-garde. And almost, I kind of wanted to be excluded a bit from it. I wanted it to be just the characters themselves, not really having to think about, am I making my mark on this vertice so that my counter, you know, can make his, you know? Right. So I think I just wanted them a little bit more in their face, and I wanted more heat, as opposed to it being, here's the section of the piece where we are doing the stereotypical Shakespeare cursing at each other that you can buy on the side of a mug, like that. It felt like that a little bit to me, whereas I wanted them to know that is something that they have to do in this moment, and I wanted them to just really give it. And again, I think it's more of a staging thing. I don't even think, I think the delivery of the lines were amazing. And again, the chemistry between Joseph and Ben was amazing to me. But so the staging of the bantering, I wanted it to be more in your face as opposed to structured.
Fair enough. And Ed, you mentioned the lighting.
Yeah,
the costumes were kind of
lighting and costume, but I think a lot of the almost all the production elements were very strong, so that's just me nitpicking.
I realized I sort of took that question a different way this time. I actually talked about a portion of the story plot as opposed to like an element of the production.
It's part of the directing.
It's true. It's part of the directing. It's part of the directing element there.
Which this piece does make you think outside of the box, Ed. Good observation.
Outside of the hole in the ground.
Yeah. Filled with boxes of gold.
Yes. Ryan, now why don't you kick us off in the next section, which is, what were some of the themes and motifs or ideas or symbolism that kind of stood out to you in this production?
Sure thing. Well, I feel like this is just very present in the text, so any production is going to have to deal with it. But just the idea of eating and like gustatory actions in general, like a lot of talk about the roots we've mentioned and the meat, and you know, the contrast between roots and meat, and like there's several scenes on stage where characters are eating, which I think makes the scene of the trays filled with water so potent. It's like, oh, this isn't food, there's been so much food, and talk about food and like consuming. Like I was like, the first time I read this play, which was like a long time ago, there's a lot of talk about like even like consuming and eating Timon, and like what predators are going to do to him. I'm like, is this going to take a Titus turn? Like that doesn't happen. But like, I just think there is a very potent idea of eating and consumption in here, which I think is going to come up again in another question I know is coming. It is. But yeah, and just like the fact that like Apamantis always had like his roots, which were carrots. I think he was, and you know, when Timon's digging for roots, and he talks about how he's confronted with the bandits and they're looking for meat, or he thinks they want meat when they just want gold, but that's what the gold can be used for. So yeah, I think, and then of course the tossing the apple back and forth is a great moment. And so like, just the idea of eating as like the kind of byproduct of what all this wealth, be it a lack thereof, comes down to.
Very true. Ed, how about you? What was a theme or motif or symbol that you kind of saw in the show?
Two big ones. The first would be temperance. Finding that mean medium of like,
Mm-hmm.
because Timon is the I guess sort of the pendulum of it, right? He swings
Yeah.
so far into his appetite and
Mm-hmm.
you know, giving gifts and not really giving a care to his own financial security.
Yeah.
And then he swings to the other side where it's like, I don't want any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe what I'm doing is right by rejecting all of these materialistic things and, you know, giving the gold away and all that. And Epaminondas, who I believe is supposed to be the person that sort of walks the middle, who has temperance, who kind of shows or kind of tells Timon, like, you don't need to be doing this to like make your point. And like Epaminondas just reminds me of, I could be quoting it wrong, but of Nietzsche's higher man, right? Where he's somebody that lives for himself and he does his own thing. And he speaks very much about it, how he is indifferent to Timon to a certain degree, and the government and the governing body to a certain degree as well.
I think I have to take issue with some of what you're saying here, though, if you don't mind, because while I think Epaminondas is certainly a foil to Timon, especially in those early scenes, I think I'm reluctant to call him like a more temperate character, and like and he certainly, I don't think he's indifferent to Timon. He's annoyed by Timon and all this excess, but he's very performatively annoyed by it. And I think he kind of gets off in being higher than thou, more so than just being in a state of Zen contentment with I know better. And the fact that he has to make a big stink about it all the time kind of makes him a bit of an ass, like to use a Shakespearean facsimile of a swear word. But yeah, like I think they represent, like, early scenes Timon and Epaminondas represent two extremes, and it's when they confront each other near the cave is when we're supposed to realize that Timon is, you know, grotesquely becoming that second extreme, that Epaminondas, like I said, I want to see an additional scene where he realizes, oh no, I was wrong for being so misanthropic, and there is a healthy middle ground.
Okay, that's a good point. My other theme would be like the sort of slave master mentality, and this I guess goes more into like a directing and with acting as well. It's in Shakespeare, from what I've read and from what I see in my interpretation of it, it's like the fool should be the person that treads that line, that kind of oversteps his bounds and speaks against. And I mean, that's usually the case when you read it or see it. The fool should be the one that steps his bound. But Linnaeus, when he was yelling at the senator for, you know, how could you, this is, Timon did all these great things for you, and, you know, throwing it all back in his face. And I think it just would have been a bigger challenge and something a bit more compelling to watch if he was sort of stifling his tongue, right? Where it's like he is speaking these words, and it is like, you know, he can only speak to, he has to really use the language to get the point across that how dare you? Because at the end of the day, that is still a senator, and that is still a servant.
Right.
So I think it just would have been a bit more interesting to see. But that's just like one like staging technical note. But like the slave master mentality throughout the show is how the slaves have more honor, or the servants have more honor than the patricians.
And how Timon is a slave to his coin, or to the debts that he expects to have people, because he's given them so much while also taking so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. Jill, I know you had quite a few themes or things that pop up in here.
Honestly, none of them have fully been fleshed out yet, so I thought I would be trailing behind here. But
lightning round, go.
So two of mine. So I have four, but they're pretty short and sweet. But two of them sort of are take a bit of a religious tone, and the other two are more of modern materialistic views. So we sort of touched on, just going back to what Ryan was saying in regards to the food. And so I mentioned roots, the whole element and motif of roots, and how I think in this production it was very cleverly fleshed out with the whole carrot eating with Epaminondas, digging into the stage, as I mentioned before in this conversation, of what is the root of the play? What is the root of Timon? What is the root of humanity? That sort of came out with me. And segueing into my second symbolic point, the idea of the apple to me, and maybe this is just by my Christian upbringing, I'm agnostic now, but the apple being the very prominent part in one of the biblical stories of the root of humanity, you know,
the
this
first of
Genesis.
knowledge.
Exactly.
That was
so
in
to
my
me,
notes too.
I saw, yeah, good, yeah. So that the apple being a root of that. And so segueing into it,
are you moving on to another one? Could I question something about that before?
Sure, yeah.
So what would you say then is the meaning behind Apomantis offering that to Timon, knowing who does the offering in the biblical story you're thinking of?
Yeah, again, that's where both my religious points aren't fully, I would say, rooted, because I don't necessarily think that Apomantis is a serpent. I think he can be somewhat just by sheer being in opposition to Timon a lot of times, or you know, jabbing his response to a lot of things. I think he can be, he doesn't shy away from sort of being that tempting or malicious presence in, how dare you stand up in the middle of the party and, you know, start talking rational when I just want to, you know. So I feel like there's elements of him being serpent-esque, but I don't think he's necessarily an Iago to Timon, as, you know.
No,
like,
no, I don't think he's overtly evil, but I would say that
yeah.
if we were to connect those two together, that he would be a serpent, and that the serpent is something that's sort of like a necessary evil because it did give us knowledge.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah.
So segueing too, there was a lot of Christ allegory for me in this show, and I think that could read on the page as well as definitely for me in this production. So just the idea of calling sort of his friends, comrades to a supper, and almost the second banquet being very resemblant of the Last Supper. You know, that's the moment where, you know, Jesus basically points out the fact that now in this, all these characters are sort of have Judas-esque qualities, but again, so none of these points are fully
like they're
going
not one
towards
to
that.
one.
I'm not saying that Timon is Jesus per se.
Well, what's interesting?
Well, Timon does dress like a shepherd. He has this huge.
But just that dinner scene too is an amalgamation for me of the Last Supper and also the temple outrage that Jesus has done in many depictions of Christ.
What I think is also. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, you can actually talk to that because mine is kind of a new thought. So.
Well, what I think is interesting is that if you kind of equate that scene with like a Last Supper, what does he serve his guests? It's not the wine that is my blood and the bread that is my body, but it's the water. Much like what Pontius Pilate washes his hands up. He washes himself of his, you know, false friends. So like, I think, that's an interesting biblical parallel to say, taking on the Pilate role there. Just
the degradation of Timon in the wilderness too. It really reminded me of, you know, the 7 stations of the cross and the torture and the terrible journey Jesus had to the cross, on the cross. It just, and then he ends up inevitably dying too. Even just the fact that, in a way, we'll get into more of this, I'm sure, when we contrast and compare him to Lear, but to me, Timon again is one of those characters that is a little bit like outside of his time, or he carries a quality that people within his social circle or within his realm don't necessarily share. So in a way, I think there's a lot of goodness that Timon has that other characters don't see or they abuse, similar to someone like Jesus, you know, where people just sheerly couldn't understand why he would be frivolously giving his life up to prostitutes and the poor and such. The whole denial sequence too of giving him money. Again, there was flashbacks of his own apostles denying him before going to the cross. So that came out to me too. And the terror that happened at the end of the show with the bombing and seeing his once comrades potentially being no more, the bombing of the Athenians, just again how supposedly there was a giant earthquake and upset in the world when Jesus perished. So there was so much little tiny slices of
also
my childhood upbringing that I was like, hey, this story kind of sounds familiar.
Like that moment at the end, especially when you're casting it in this biblical light, it almost feels like the apocalypse and the rapture. Like the fact that all of the senators who wronged him are now dead, and it's just Alcibiades standing alone, and he's like, I am the one true virtuous man, so to speak. Yeah.
And then my next two, I'll kind of make shorter, but putting up an appearance, I think, is huge in this show, and even more so with this production. We kind of already touched on it, but the whole the brand names in every different house, not only were they present, but all houses were different brand names. The business women, their hair was similar to kind of my hybrid hair going on here. It was very, this is my place in society to be a woman in business. I need to look astute. I need to have a certain swagger about me. And then even like Apamentis sort of defying the whole, what does it mean to put up appearance? I liked his sort of frumpy philosopher look and how he didn't change his clothes. So again, maybe he's a serpent in a sense too of being a bit breaking the rules, devilish of I'm not going to put up appearance. You get what you get. So there was a lot of comparison contrast to that for me. And then we already kind of touched on this, but the whole idea of excess.
That's definitely there.
Yeah, and a lot of that to do was apparent to me in props. Like we talked about, not only is it just iPhones we're using in this, it's iPhone, VR, and iPad. Same with the money. It's presented in a check, it's presented in actual coins, it's presented in stacks of cash. It can't just be one.
Silver stallions.
Yes. Yeah, the silver stallions. I was actually going to put that too. I was like, not necessarily, but it's worth something. So, and the party scene alone, it went on so long. There was so many different elements. The giant angel wings. I'm like, okay, I'm here for it. I don't necessarily fully understand what's going on, but that's end of my mini lecture on symbols and
beautiful. And basically, all right, and we are now heading into the next question, because Jill, you kind of covered all my points for themes and motifs with the apples and religion and as well as gluttony, all that good stuff. So we're not going to labor on this any longer.
Okay.
But let's head into the next part, which is, does this production hit the mark and is it worth the watch? Ed, I want you to kick this one off. So fire away.
I do think it is worth the watch. I've never seen Timon of Athens before, and I did enjoy watching this production. So it makes me want to go read it for certain. I think it's worth the watch. That's what I think. I mean, I haven't read it, so I can't say too much, but I would say that it hit the mark.
Yes. Ryan, as our resident TA, is this one you would want to show?
I like how that's how you always pose this question to me. So I think, yes, it definitely did hit the mark. I enjoyed it very much. I have read the play before, but I've never seen it performed. So I think this was like a good first production to see. I think it's interesting. Something I said back when we talked about Coriolanus is that of the 5 Shakespeare productions we've seen so far in the series, this and Coriolanus are probably the 2 most obscure or least commonly seen and produced. So I think it's interesting that those are the 2 that have both committed to this contemporary setting. Because the way I see it, I think people who haven't seen Timon before or Coriolanus, they're probably an easier sell for the old-timey productions. I've never seen that before, or the classic Pure Dress. Also keep in mind, both of which are set not in medieval or early modern Europe, but in ancient antiquity, or Greece and Rome respectively, or flip that because Coriolanus was first, but so I think there is something bold about taking the less commonly known plays, and as opposed to say doing we've all seen Hamlet, let's do a contemporary Hamlet. You've never seen Timon before, well, here's our fancy contemporary Timon. Something that I will say is that I will also add that I have a feeling, I don't want to psychoanalyze Stephen Ouimette, or it's not even really psychoanalysis here, but if I had to guess, I would say the entire concept of the show probably spun out of the idea to do the mask as a stripper party.
Interesting.
And I will kind of say this, it was something I was thinking while watching it, but it kind of cemented a little more when afterward I was watching. I don't know if any of you watched it. It was Anthony talking to Margaret Atwood. Which
I haven't had a chance to see it yet. No, yes.
He said something very interesting to Margaret Atwood, in that he was quoting something that Tyrone Guthrie said about this show, and I wrote it down because I thought it was fascinating. And it's all the boys together is how Tyrone Guthrie summed up this play. It's all the boys together, and I think that is interesting, especially because like there aren't a lot of female characters, certainly not a lot of prominent female characters, unless you really do like. And like what's interesting about that mask scene is that it starts with one of Timon's friends says the ladies are here, and then and as soon as you put this in like this contemporary businessman setting, like it kind of clicks very obviously that the ladies are putting on a show for us. Okay, it's the stripper party as this, and like when I think about the mask in the original, probably attempting to be the symbol of like excess that only like courtly performances would ever be a mask in this way, more so than like the popular performance for the public. I think this idea of like it's all the boys together, this real boys club, this favor economy that doesn't actually pan out when you think about it in actual monetary terms, as Timon learns very aggressively. Jill, do you want to say something?
Also, just what a great initial, if that was sort of the root of why to do this production. What an awesome cast bonding moment. I couldn't help but I literally got to a point, I'm watching it, and then, it took me a while. Okay, this is happening. Oh, okay, love that this is happening. Okay, and then I literally was doing this, watching. And then I started thinking, as an actor who I love, if I had the opportunity to really get to know my casts and kind of chummy with them, I just kept being like, oh my God, no, they're probably going to go out after the show and have a drink together, and just like, it, to me, it reminded me of almost the curtain call. The same thing when they left that scene, and then when you see them leaving the curtain call, I was like, oh, it's that same energy, and so it would be super neat if that was the first, like, here you go ham, pretend to have a party, chat amongst yourselves, and now let's create a play around it,
So Mac, like to tie this all back to your question of do I think it hits the mark, would I show it to students? I don't have the same gut impulse that I had about the Lepage Coriolanus, where I'm like, this wouldn't be what I would show students of Shakespeare or theater history, like for introducing Coriolanus, but it would be what I show directing students. This one I think works very well as an introduction to Timon. I think Timon is also just like a stranger play, which I know the next few questions that we're about to ask are going to really flesh that out more, so I'll hold my tongue on that for a moment. But I think it works for me. I would show students to it. I would recommend it to friends. And well done, it hit the mark.
Very good, very good. Jill, what sayeth you?
Yeah, same as my pals have already said. So far, this has been the favorite one we've watched so far for me personally. Because I think, again, it had Coriolanus comes in close second, because as I've already mentioned before, this play does a really good job of sort of creating enough of a modern umbrella, but almost it being post-apocalyptic, so that in a way the viewers can always relate to what's going on, but then it always has them, their brains always have to be on, in a sense, as well. If that makes sense. It's enough cushiness to kind of like watch what's going on. I can relate to this, but then there's always like, I wonder what's going to happen next. I wonder what vibe of the scene is happening next. Where I found some of the shows that we've watched in this series that have been more of a period piece or so, I knew which era we were in. I kind of knew where the story was going, but with pieces with this, I like, and in that whole thing, I talked about this with Coriolanus too, we're encompassing any type of audience member. This piece does a really good job of that, because it has them questioning what's going to happen next. It has that relatability factor, and it also shows, as I mentioned before, this traditional Shakespearean text in a modern light. And especially, I think this, if I were to say, of anyone watching so far this series, if I were to say, okay, you only have to watch one of Stratford's online thing, I would say this one, especially because...
Preferably watch them all.
Yes, exactly. But I would say this one because I 1000% was on board with the filming of this one, especially because we were in a round where, for people who aren't familiar, with seeing theater in the round. You usually, as an audience member in the theater, you only get one perspective of a character's facial expressions or the dialogue they're saying, and the other character's back has to be to you, because so that your audience friends across the way can have that same effect. So what's really awesome, and I was like, I can't believe I haven't made this relation before, but that's what film does too. Film can only give us a certain scope of a character. And so I think the filming of this production just bled way into film in a sense already. And I knew I wasn't missing anything, because I'm like, well, you know, if I was sitting on that side of the theater, then yes, I would be looking at Flaminius right now. I wouldn't have the opportunity to look at what the other characters are doing. So I think it's a really true depiction of sitting in the theater and watching a piece, especially if theater down the way is going to become more of a virtual experience. I think if we get to a point where troops are allowed to sort of small groups get together and put on performances again, I think doing theater in the round, if it's going to be recorded and to have people virtually enjoy it, I think doing it in the round as opposed to proscenium or even thrust really is the way to go. I guess thrust would work too. It would just not necessarily be full circle, it's around. But yeah, so our modern take on theater being more filmic in a sense anyways, I 100% would recommend this as a watch.
Fair enough. And I will piggyback on everybody. I would definitely agree with everybody saying this production stuck the landing. This is another great example of a director having a concept and then seeing it all the way through in all those little details, whether it's the set, the costumes, the lighting, just hitting every one of those marks and just landing the show really well. I mean, performance-wise, we've talked about, there were a few hiccups with Joseph Ziegler where we kind of went, maybe would have wished a little bit more of a varied performance, but that just could have been the day of, where he was playing to the camera. We don't know. But like, I mean, overall,
a great performer otherwise.
It's still he's a fantastic performer. I mean, I've seen him twice in The Crucible, and both times he's wonderful. Biff Loman was fantastic.
A couple weeks ago when we saw him play Duncan, I think that role was perfect for him, because Duncan is basically Act 1 Timon.
Yes.
and that was the part that I think we agreed he was stronger in than in the second half of the play.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Very good.
So for sure, I would definitely say, and I also will say, I would definitely want to be showing this to people, because I think Timon is a play that should move up in the Shakespeare canon ranks. Like, I think it's very much on the lower end of people's watch list, kind of like a King John or a Pericles, which we'll be getting to in this series.
Mac, it's funny that when, like, my first thought, and I didn't say this, but when you asked me would I show this to students, I'm like, well, we're never going to assign Timon even in a full course of Shakespeare, so it doesn't matter. But like,
you could though swap something else out. Like, I would love to do a like obscure Shakespeare class where it's like, let's look at all the obscure.
Well, and to me, it's
like a Cymbeline or
the most
Timon.
Like relevant on a social realm. It's the most hitting the mark for what society is today. It's almost like, how have I never studied this play before, or let alone hear about it? You know, and watching it, I'm like, oh wow, like
very true. Okay, all right. So woohoo! All stars for us for saying let's show it to the world. Let's head now into our textual kind of play-based question. We've talked about the production, now let's kind of dive into the play a bit. So our first question is, oftentimes when people are looking through the Shakespeare canon or watching Shakespeare, they often say Timon of Athens and King Lear are companion pieces. They kind of came out in and around the same time. They're very similar to each other. So do you think these two pieces actually, is this true? Like, do they go together? Are they kind of a couple play? Jill, why don't you kick us off on this front?
Sure. So I initially started out with a flat no, and I had made a whole list of contrasting that I will share, but I will say by the end of it, I was like, oh, maybe it's because they're kind of similar, but also very different, that they do go really well. So the first thing, you know, just going bare facts or whatever, I was like, King Lear's king, Timon's a lord. Already there's a different hierarchy in society we're dealing with. To me, I think the initial depiction of each character is very different. I sense more of a selfish vibe from Lear as opposed to a selfless vibe from Timon. So again, they didn't sort of match up in that way for me. We kind of already touched a little bit when we talked about Lear and Timon earlier, but the decay of each character was very different for me. I think Lear's was more mental and Timon's was more physical. You know, just like it started his whole Lear was kind of rooted in the mind and rooted in the family, whereas Timon was initially rooted in materialism, and so that melting away and then showing him in this production, literally each scene of him in the wilderness, he is decaying. So again, their spiral was different for me. It was mental and physical. And then I kind of already touched on this too, family being the roots of Lear, but then more comrades and money being the roots of Timon. So I was like, okay, they're very different, but kind of hovering around the same old guy contemplating life alone. But I think the overall thing that would make it different for me is that their drives are very different. So yeah, so I guess in a nutshell, companion pieces, but very different characters in my opinion.
Interesting. I will piggyback off you on this.
Yeah.
Because thematically, I think they're very similar to each other, where both plays feature this kind of elder statesman who starts kind of in the land of power and privilege, and then ultimately kind of get thrust out into the wilderness and that's kind of where their kind of similarities in. But I would say the other companion piece though is Coriolanus. Like Timon, I think of it as the love child of Lear and Coriolanus, where Shakespeare wrote this and kind of took the best elements of both of his plays, where he's like, let's take the sack the city, turn against the city elements of Coriolanus. We're going to take those elements and add that in. Then we're going to take the kind of descent. We're going to take the man being forced out into the wilderness from Lear, and we're going to marry those together and create this one play. So for me, I kind of go, yeah, I'd definitely say you could program it where they're in the same season where you have the Lear also playing Timon, and then you also have the Fool playing Flavius as well. You could definitely do.
I think Epimantis is closer to the Fool archetype, whereas I would say Flavius is more of like the Albany or Kent, one of these like good loyal men.
Okay. Fair enough.
Probably more so Kent than anything, because like
true. Actually, yeah, I could see that.
And like Epimantis he's less like overtly like the Fool, because he has to also go through his own little arc, whereas the Fool is just going to be like, I'm right about everything of the
right. Yes.
Yeah.
But Ryan, what do you think? Do these pieces go together?
So I have a lot of thoughts about this, so bear with me. So
initiate mini lecture number 2.
Great.
So I would say I definitely agree with the comparison, and I think the production team agrees with it too, because you may have noticed that there was a thunderclap and a start of a storm in the sound design, which isn't, like, I double checked, it's not there in the text. Like, that was whole cloth a decision by this production, which I think is very much hinting at like, ooh, Timon's going into the storm, even though
right.
I would say that while these are very palpable comparisons, I would call Timon silly Lear, if I had to like give it like a
silly Lear.
This is a much sillier play than King Lear is, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's fun. I enjoyed it from beginning to end. And I think part of what drives me to say this is that like the plot, you know, everything from Act 1 and Act 3 to that, it feels like one play, and everything in Act 4 and 5 feels like almost a whole different play. And like I see the link that bridges them together, but at the same time, like I commented on this earlier with Joseph Ziegler's performance compared to Colin Feore's performance of Lear, that like, whereas I saw the very clear progression of this is Lear descending into madness, whereas I felt like Ziegler was playing almost two separate characters. And I think that kind of comes with the territory of the text too, that there is such a stark shift. And even though there is the scene of him throwing water in the faces of his former friends, I think it still just feels like a completely different, like the play that I would almost, even more so than Lear, compare the second half to is actually not one by Shakespeare, and it's one by Sophocles, Oedipus at Colonus. I don't know if you're all familiar with this play, but it's the it's the timeline of the Sophocles Theban plays is complicated, but basically it's the last one that he wrote, but it's set between Oedipus the king and Antigone. It's basically after the events of Oedipus the king, Oedipus goes into exile, and actually also takes place in Athens, so I don't think this is a coincidental comparison, but Colonus, which is like the small township near Athens. And the whole plot of that play is just Oedipus is like, oh no, I'm blind, all that stuff happened, I did these horrible things, but is very steadfast when all of the other minor characters from that first play come and say, Oedipus, we need you to come back to Thebes, it's chaos, or you need to be buried because that's why the war is happening, because you haven't done your proper burial rites. And he's like, no, I will stay. And the entire second half of Timon, to me, feels so much more like that than it does feel like Lear, with grace in his heart and flowers in his hair in that whole storm sequence, or after the storm sequence, so to speak. I would say, so that's, I think, an interesting, more fruitful comparison that I want to draw. But the big thing, this is my last one, and then, we can move on. Sorry if I'm dominating this a little bit.
No, you're good. You're good. You're doing fine.
But I think the most important distinction that I would draw between these plays, and Jill, what you said, it's kind of on similar lines, but I would take it in a slightly different direction. And Timon, to me, seems like Lear minus the redemption.
Yeah.
Or in many ways, I think, and since this was presumably written later, that maybe Shakespeare was changing his ideas on what redemption means. But while Lear comes out of the other side of this crucible as a changed man, realizes the error of his ways, for Timon, it seems that staying in the cave, staying in exile, is his redemption. It's not the crucible that he has to go through to arrive at redemption. I think it's very interesting, the fact that like in the text, it's 2 scenes before the end of the play is the last time we even see the main character. He doesn't die in the final scene. We're told that he's dead after the fact, so I think perhaps this is Shakespeare revising his idea of what does redemption mean. If I'm revisiting, what Lear should have done, maybe Lear should have just stayed in the storm instead of joining Cornelius' camp with the French army. But yeah, I think these are obviously very similar plays, but when you really dig into the details, I think there's enough different about them that it might be a bit of an oversimplification to call them companion pieces.
So you're saying when you get to the root of each piece.
You are on a roll.
I am on a roll.
Say, I tip my cap to you.
Ed, what sayeth you?
Yeah, I gave it a flat no. For comparison. I totally agree. They are similar pieces. I won't say very similar pieces. They are similar pieces. I see it where the companion part of it possibly comes from, they share those similarities, those similar elements. I would see it like how if you were to stage Macbeth after Hamlet or vice versa, or, in that order, they're both bloody, or they both have death, and they both deal with apparitions, and I see it like that, where they share some elements.
It is often said that Macbeth is basically Hamlet from Claudius's perspective, or vice versa. Hamlet is just Macbeth from Malcolm's perspective. So it is interesting that you draw, not that they are themselves companion pieces, but you're not wrong for drawing that comparison.
Yeah, that's how I see this, where it's just they're very clear elements that I can see where people would think it's a companion piece. I don't think it's a companion piece. I think the heart or the philosophies that each one are striving towards, symbolism that each one carries, are different and telling a different story.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, now we have our next question, which is it possible to read this play, Timon of Athens, as one of Shakespeare's more overtly anti-capitalist plays, and what might he be trying to say about money, poverty, and the economy? Ryan, why don't you kick us off on this one?
Okay, sure. So right off the bat, I would say that capitalism meant something very different in Shakespeare's time than it does to us today, and that is worth noting. That said, I think this production, with its like businessman motifs and design, very much does get at the root of, you know, what capitalism means today, and these characters being these agents of it. But yeah, just the fact that, to me, this almost feels, the plot feels like it's more out of Strindberg than Shakespeare to me. Just the fact that it's all concerned with like creditors wanting their due and having to pay old debts. Like, Strindberg quite literally wrote a play called Creditors that is more about relationships, romantic relationships, but still comes in on this idea of coming and knocking for what's due. And yeah, like just the fact that more so than any other Shakespeare play I can think of, and maybe Merchant of Venice is another similar one, and I'm sure after we stop recording, I'll probably think of 30 more, but yeah, money seems to play such an important role in the tragedy of this play, and whereas Merchant isn't a tragedy, I think that's why it feels so much more palpable here. And I think the speech that really cements it to me is when Timon is speaking to his gold. I believe it's in Act 4, Scene 3, and he says, "Oh, thou sweet king killer," and he goes on this whole lament talking to the gold. And like, if ever there was a thesis statement for this play, I think it's like, money is the root of all evil. But yeah, like it's that everything goes wrong because, and I also think there is an interesting reading to do today, like with the fact that, you know, Timon's wealth does not exist. And like when we think about, you know, fiat currency and even Bitcoin, for example, like just the fact that, you know, ever since, you know, if we want to comment on the gold standard, like a real Frank Baum here, but like, just the fact that, yeah, ever since we've gotten off the gold standard, like the actual, like, you know, units of currency are arbitrarily decided just based on market powers, and even like just the fact that we ever gave value to gold in the first place, it kind of is like the arbitrariness of money, and much like Timon's wealth, which only exists on paper because he thinks he has it because these people owe him, but he really owes them. Yeah, I think there's like a very scathing critique here, and certainly the staging that this production did by setting it like in the dressings of contemporary capitalist culture and neoliberalism in particular really brought that out. So I would agree.
Interesting.
Shakespeare was a comrade.
Interesting. Jill?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you posed this question, Mac, I didn't really. Obviously, politics was playing a large part of this piece, but the scope that I was looking at, it was never as politically charged for me as it was more of like an anthropologic charge or philosophical one. Anthropological, there we go. Because to me, I think it's more about humanity itself than politics. It's a lot more about individuals than the masses. So this is a great contrast to something like Coriolanus, which I think that overtly is a political piece, even in Shakespeare's time and especially now. With this one, of course, that was the underbelly of it, but it was more so to me hitting home the importance of analyzing humans under a microscope. And how the idea of money and property and economy obviously matter in the world. It's how the world works, but it cannot function properly without genuine relationships between people. And I use genuine in a light sense. I'm not talking about everyone is each other's best friend, because clearly, unfortunately, humans detest each other a lot. But that's what kind of played the part for me, was without true relationships of people, and this is hit in almost all of Timon's speeches, nothing else really can exist, you know. And so yes, I think it nods definitely to be a play that 100% can be staged to speak to an anti-capitalist sort of vibe, but I think it does a disservice if you only see it that way, or if you focus that way, because I think what was beautiful about this piece is that it's a character of Shakespeare's that I don't think we see often, where at least at the beginning, you see this selfless good guy, you know. You almost, every time you're introduced to a Shakespearean character, you have their qualities in the palm of your hand, but you also have, like that's where you're wrong, or that's where you're leaving a bit of a distaste in my mouth. To me, Timon wasn't really that. Like he to me was pure and selfless, even though what he dabbled in, sure, could have been excessive, and but he was just a nice guy. And then it's just heartbreaking, him hitting home the whole lack of genuine relationships between people. And I think there's enough stuff in the canon that can touch on a political realm. I think this one needs to be rooted in human, what it
Goodness
means
gracious, all these roots.
To be a genuine human being. And I think that's a dose of that everyone in today's society can have as well. So
and I'll piggyback off you on this, because I too also don't feel this is particularly anti-capitalist. I think it's more just Shakespeare commenting on class in general, like just societal class between people.
Not a capitalist like
concern? No. I think it's about these different statuses within these communities, and just how as humans we're all about ourselves and we're not about helping each other. Like Timon is the opposite of that. Like there's a great talk between Ben Carlson and Joseph Ziegler where Ben Carlson in rehearsal was like, "What's wrong with Timon? Like why is he giving away all his money and doing all this good stuff for people?" And Ziegler was like, "There's nothing wrong with him. It's the rest of society that's totally backwards and refuses to help him, because if we all helped each other, then we wouldn't have these issues." And then ties in with money, where like we have the robber scene at the hole where they all show up to rob Timon, and he gives them the money, and the one robber says, "Well, now that I have the money, I don't feel the need to go and loot and do all these horrible things. Like I'm
Mac,
okay."
If I can interject, like everything you're saying sounds like you're agreeing with
socialist
that. This is a critique of capitalism, like just the fact that yes, if we were all like Timon and we weren't concerned with needing, all this money, like it would be a better place. And perhaps, the fact that he, can't, cooperate with the people, like is a critique against the idea that we need to be cutthroat and seek out only our best interests, when a more collective idea of how to share resources would be better. And even like the robber scene that you just mentioned, I think comes down to the fact that, now that my needs are met, I don't even want it wasn't about the personal drive to need it. It's because these robbers, they need money to eat. Which
they do, exactly. And that's it. Like when there's no money and they're desperate, of course they're going to go loot. I know.
So it doesn't sound like it doesn't sound like you're disagreeing with the anti-capitalist reading. It sounds like everything you're saying is kind of playing right into it, if you ask me.
I don't know, because maybe it's the term anti-capitalist that I disagree with, because capitalism is its own thing, like trickle-down economics. Like that kind of falls in that whole area where it's kind of top to bottom reaching versus that. So maybe it's the term that we're using, anti-capitalist, is what I'm not fully.
Okay, what would you use instead?
Like I said, I think it's more
a socialist piece.
Exactly. Like I could Shakespeare talking about humanity's way they treat each other, because like if you think about it, back in the Elizabethan age or Jacobean age, depending on when this was performed, 1600s, like back then it was the king top down, whereas that whole thing of the king was first, and you went down lords, earls, whatever, peasants, and the fact that he was commenting on sometimes you had these plagues and these crises or famines where like instead of helping each other, they all kind of turned on each other and went, "Screw you." And that's the same thing that happens with Timon, where Timon goes, "I've given everybody, I gave people my horse, I helped you get out of debtor's prison, all these things." And then ultimately they're like, "Well, I just made all these investments, I can't help you," which is something we've all kind of had a situation where we've seen a homeless person say, "Hey, can you spare $5?" And a lot of times we go, "No, I'm sorry, I don't have any change on me," or "No, I'm sorry, I can't help you." It's that same type of thing where as a society we do this, where it's self versus us, which I think
you're
is
saying
more,
I feel like what you're trying to get at, Mac, is that it's similar to my vein of if it's more of a scope on humanity as opposed to politics.
Bingo, exactly.
Yeah, like that's, I feel, because in a way I agree. If we were to paste politics onto this 100%, it's more of a socialist, which quite literally is, you could argue, anti-capitalism. So like I think it is. It's the term that it's not important to put the term in the spotlight. Because I also think it doesn't really. Sorry, Ed. Hey, what's up?
Sorry, Ed. We're gonna get him to weigh in after.
I also think it also doesn't set us up properly for it to fully be considered an anti-capitalist or socialist piece, because he does come from sort of a capitalist point of view. You know, he was born as a lord. He doesn't necessarily know the trials and tribulation of the ladder. The lower down on the ladder of hierarchy of humans. He sort of places himself in that by the end of the play, but I think in a way it can't really be a socialist or an anti-capitalist piece, because it's not fair to do that. I feel like you would need the main character to be more of like a mediocre human, or one that's lower down on the hierarchy of humans.
My rejoinder to that would be that, you know, it's the argument that, like, what, you know, when we talk about whether or not there should be billionaires in the world, like, does anybody need $1 billion, or once you like, and like I maybe Elon Musk say is a great guy personally, but that doesn't change the fact that, you know, nobody needs that much money, and let alone him. So like, I don't know. We don't need to keep harping this point.
I want Ed to weigh in on this.
Interconnected issues.
Ed, what sayeth you?
I could use $1 billion.
Couldn't we all?
No, we shouldn't.
I agree with Jillian, where I wasn't really watching it. I don't usually watch plays through a political lens, though I guess I should develop that eye. But I was really paying attention to its more philosophical, symbolic elements, and I do think it plays better with those elements than it does with whether this is communist, anti-capitalist, or capitalist. Though I do think, and I do agree that you can stage it that way, and if that was the goal, then I guess you could take that away from it. But I see the piece as being very much hitting on like the human condition, reference to like material things and like excess and not having. And I don't see Timon as a good character to be. And I don't see the senators as black as they are depicted, right? Because they're not at a loss of money. And even if they do have, excess, they are still taking care of their money. It goes back to that phrase that I always like to say is like, I got it from the movie Night Stalker with Jake Gyllenhaal. Is like to win I like that movie a lot. To win the lottery, you got to make the money to buy the ticket, right? Yeah. And so because the thing this is why I think this is a very gray piece, where I don't think Timon was in the right to be lending out all the money that he has. And I think as adults, as we get older, and I think adults and older people should know this by now, that that's not something that one should be doing whenever they are, in financial spots or anything like that. So there's something to learn from Timon. And then when it comes to the senators and refusing him, they never asked for those things. He just gave them to him.
And one person does offer to pay him back originally, and Timon goes, no. And then something bad happens, and he expects it to be returned.
So I don't see the senators as completely bad or, ill in their reasoning. So
I will say,
that's my,
you can stretch, instead of literally taking it as a monetary viewpoint of the sheer fact of Timon just being a very giving, because I remember, Joe, it's Ziegler, correct?
Joseph Ziegler, yes.
In his conversation with Anthony and Ben, he was saying how Timon's just to get at least his depiction of, or his how he wanted to play the character was, he just is a giving guy. That's just his nature is to give, and in this sense, it's money. But I think if you were to even do a totally different directorial perspective on this piece, you could have it being another form of charity, just this giving. If you chose to, like, I totally agree with you, Ed, and I think that's what's super neat about this piece, and because it hasn't been done often, there's so many different avenues you can take on Timon alone. You can kind of make him this, maybe they're all facets of humanity that have pros and cons, including Timon himself.
Yeah.
Or you could do the contrast of Timon being this one person that no one else can understand because he sheerly lives his life on just being a charitable, good-hearted person, where the rest of humanity doesn't. So I wasn't disagreeing with you at all, but I'm just saying, like, it's cool to see if obviously the text in this production lends itself to money being this object of greed and despair or whatever, but that can easily be viewed differently in a place like this too.
There we go. Well said, everybody. All right, now we get into the final question of this episode, which is, why do we think this play is not performed as often? Like, why is this one of the least performed plays in the Shakespeare canon? Ed, I want you to kick this one off.
I mean, I've never heard of it.
You're like, it's in my anthology, but
when I heard I just got Shakespeare's complete works, so I plan to have like read every single one of his plays by the time this whole quarantine ends. But
good challenge for yourself.
Yeah, no, Timon of Athens, I thought it was something else. I was like, is there still Shakespeare? But I think because, like, all Shakespeare pieces are very dialogue driven and very dialogue focused. Like that's the key to Shakespeare, is the dialogue. And Timon, I just think, is just one of those pieces where it's like, it is all dialogue. Like it is important to get those nuances, especially within Timon's speeches and you know, like his like what others are saying as well in the piece. And I think it's such, and just going back to how, you know, with like the symbolism and the philosophy of this play, or the different philosophies of this play, it's very educational. It really hits upon the human condition in my eyes. And, you know, he's so old when he experiences all of this. It's like, gosh, he learned this so late. So yeah, I think that's why there's just not as much action as a lot of the big plays have, or with the like the King's plays. Those ones are very historical, so like I can see why those are popular. But with Timon, I think it's because it is very philosophical and very much more so than other Shakespeare plays, dialogue driven.
Yes. Ryan, as the resident TA, why do you think this is not put on the syllabus compared to other ones?
Well, something about syllabi, I guess, that is worth getting into is that, like, curricula in terms of whether or not like a certain play will be like popular or well received, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, you know, usually we try to, when we're designing a syllabus, we want to introduce students to the plays that we feel like it's most important for them to be aware of as citizens of the theater community when they enter that world. And like maybe we'll put in one or two more obscure plays if it's a personal interest of the professor, but more often than not, it's like, okay, every theater student and theater worker needs to know Hamlet and probably needs to know Macbeth and The Tempest and Midsummer and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the fact that, you know, it is self-fulfilling that, like, oh, they don't need to know Timon, therefore they won't know Timon. And like, therefore, in the future, like, if everybody needed to know Timon, it would be on the syllabus. And I know this is circular logic. I think kind of, Ed, you were hitting the nail on the head a little there about how this isn't like a very action-heavy play, especially in its second half. I think there is a reason why Oedipus the King, to use the example from before, is always on, you know, introductory theater survey syllabi, but not Oedipus at Colonist, which is has a lot less action to it and certainly not as tight a plot. And I think the plotting here is not so tight. One last thing I would kind of add is that we don't need to make like a big whole thing about this, but it is often said that the authorship of this play is somewhat contested.
I was in my notes too.
But yeah, like just the fact, like some scholars even, like what a lot have noted, that there is clear evidence of multiple hands, you know, or collaborators in the writing of this, and often people will clearly identify Thomas Middleton as identifiably wrote part of this play. And I noticed that in academia there is quite a bit of bias against some of Shakespeare's more collaboratively authored works. I think there is, you know, like to use like Henry VIII and Two Noble Kinsmen, which we know for a fact were co-authored by John Fletcher. Those are also lower on the end of which ones get produced. And I think, you know, there is this like myth of the autonomy of Shakespeare as the individual genius sitting around, and we tend to not look too kindly on things that perhaps throw a bit of a wrench into it. And nobody can dispute Shakespeare's genius, so I don't know why we need to be so insecure about it. Also, something that I double checked now before we started filming the show, because I thought I had it in my head, but I was wrong about this, is that they're also speaking of some ideas of contested authorship in this way. There are some plays that didn't appear in some of the earlier folios of Shakespeare's work. Pericles and Two Noble Kinsmen are usually the two main ones for that, which also gives some reason to speculate that Shakespeare was not necessarily the entire author of the work. It has this proto-apocryphal status in a way. And I think that does make people a little squeamish, especially since we're trying to put forward the idea that this is Shakespeare. Shakespeare is the greatest writer ever, but like, well, how do we know where Shakespeare ends and Middleton and or other collaborators begin? So I think that has a lot to do with the bias that I discussed earlier.
That was also in my notes as well, where I wrote, because this is one of the plays that is accredited as a Shakespeare collab play, it comes across to people as the lesser of the canon. So people are like, oh, well, we won't want to touch those because of that. So that was one of the first notes I made on that front as well. I also just noted, too, that because this is labeled as a problem play, similar to Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, a lot of these other kind of problem plays, the problem plays aren't done as often because people find them directorially or whatever more difficult to get on stage and satisfy the audience. So from a producing element, it's one of the things of, great, we got to stage something that people are going to have problems with. It's like I remember watching Henry VIII that Stratford just did with Jonathan Goad, and it ends in a really weird way where it's like it ends with the birth of Elizabeth, and it kind of negates all of Anne Boleyn and kind of focuses on Catherine of Aragon, and it's like, this is a weird kind of play. It doesn't kind of. It kind of like, leaves you wanting more. It's like I want to get more into this.
For people to say, oh, that doesn't make much sense. It must be Fletcher's fault because he is credited as a co-author. This play couldn't be Shakespeare that later in life maybe had a few missteps or you know, some more confusing plays. Like I think we put way too much currency on Shakespeare can do no wrong. And I kind of always like to point out that in most Shakespeare plays, there's usually this one scene or one line of dialogue that really just doesn't work as much as like the rest is brilliant. Like it, so I think, you know, there is reason why people are concerned about that.
Yeah, and I also just want to note that as we've talked about, this play kind of has the highlight elements of other plays, whether it's a Coriolanus, a Lear, where like if you're going to be producing something, it's like, well, why am I just going to go for like the play that kind of took those good elements and kind of cobbled together a mismatched puzzle, and I can just do King Lear, which has a lot of great highlight elements all together in one versus taking the cobbled one, which I see Jill wants to piggyback. So Jill, go.
Because I think we've talked a lot of comparison between Lear and Coriolanus, and to me those are more like Ed was saying, drawn out, big, like lots of characters, huge storyline, whereas this quite possibly is like a novella version of, you know, sometimes you don't want to read that 400-page Harry Potter novel. You just want to read like a little tiny novella of, you know, and I think Timon does provide us with that. I literally, my first answer to why do you not think this is performed often, and I was like, I don't know, but hot damn, I want it to be, because I think it's just like a really good, it's a tidbit of Shakespeare, and like I hit on before too, I think it speaks a lot to it kind of places humanity on the head, which I think is a reason quite possibly in Shakespearean time maybe what this wasn't done, especially because a lot of like the turmoil had to do with depicting wealth as being this bad thing. where like in his time, quite honestly, it's because of the wealth and the higher status folks that he was able to put on these plays, or like have the finance to do that. So you kind of don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, and in a way.
Very true.
So I think quite possibly it could be, I'm going to say it again, rooted back to Shakespearean times, because it was not a show that was done often. I think it just doesn't have the wherewithal that other pieces in his canon do, that we know, like R&J has been literally defies time. It has so much more, the spine on that book is way more whittled than Timon's would be, right? But I think kind of going to, and Ryan, maybe this is food for thought, I think especially post-pandemic, it would be very interesting, and I think needed, to do a course on politically analyzing Shakespeare. Or so Ed, you might want to join if you'd like to jump on the political viewpoint bandwagon.
I'll get on my student portal now.
Yeah, there it is. It just would be super beneficial, I think, to have pieces like this. And even Coriolanus is not necessarily, like, I had the privilege of studying that at U of T when I was there, but I think it was one of the things that the professor really took a liking to it, and it was very politically relevant at the time. I think I took it the year that Trump was elected, or the year after. Anyway,
boy.
So right, so we had to throw a political piece in there for sure, but I think including this in a syllabus going forward in regards to taking the politics of Shakespeare, I think would be a super neat course.
Writing a letter to the dean right now. And
love it so much. And so I think you might, hopefully this play will be performed more, especially if folks, I think where Stratford placed this in their sort of virtual viewing order, or table of contents rather, is awesome, because I think they've drawn in, I mean, there was no doubt that they would, but they've definitely drawn in a constant audience at this point. And I think this piece is in a really cushy area of being, oh, hey, look at this one, right? And
it's not the one you want to open with, like, wet the palate.
Right. But maybe people will have the same sort of insights we've been chatting about of this being a relevant piece and something to perform more often now, especially with the times we're dealing with. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's it for this panel for today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of The Cup. We love doing these with you. We have a very exciting panel happening next time, as we're doing Love's Labor's Lost. So we'll be talking all about gender and identity in that, and we'll have some fun there with a very special panel again. So be sure to tune in next week for that. Jill, where can people find you if they want to tune in to see more what you do?
For sure. People can find me on my artist Instagram account. It's Jillian.Robinson96. I also love to dabble in musicals and singing and quirkiness too. So you'll see my whole spiel on there.
Maybe that'll be a next part of the Cup series is we'll go into Broadway HD and start doing some musical analysis.
Love that.
Just to have some 100% fun
100% on board. Special guest already.
We'll bring Ryan in for that one for sure. Ryan, where can people find you?
You can't, so don't. Just follow Cup of Hemlock instead, and I would be mighty appreciative of that.
Wonderful. Yes, follow Cup of Hemlock on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We're doing all types of fun posts and social things, and we got some really neat things coming on the socials in the very near future, so be sure to be following us so you don't miss anything good that's coming. Ed, how can people find you?
I just want to say I love Ryan's responses. I'll find you, Ryan.
I have on the one social media already. I just don't want strangers adding me on Facebook.
If you have any questions for Ryan, just message me on my Instagram at Edmond_Clark_official, and I will just bog Ryan down with this.
Yes. Ed is my secretary. I am right
now. Or you know what, Ed, take all of the conversations and then keep them documented, but never show Ryan. And it's like, did it even happen?
I'll show him years down the road. It's like, hey, man, you really need to answer these questions.
A little time capsule for future discovery.
Absolutely. And you can follow me on all social media platforms at Mackenzie Horner. Also, be sure to tune into my podcast, Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast.
Also, before we go, I think Will wants us to plug Ibsen's Ghosts, which is going to be shared on our YouTube channel possibly soon. I don't really know timeline-wise in relation to when this goes up, but
we'll still be a little bit ways to go.
a little bit of ways to
but
go.
Yes,
As part of
yes.
our Play Book Club series. But yes, we are working on Ibsen's Ghosts, which is going to be going up probably sometime in July on this
mid-July
very
we will
YouTube
be.
channel. So if you haven't subscribed already and you want to spend some time with the sun, you might want to subscribe now and never miss an episode of
And
either.
you might see some friendly faces performing.
Yeah, one or
Quite
two.
possibly.
You probably will. But yes, definitely tune in. We have live play readings,
Which may
that
or may
we
not
are
be live.
well live.
Mhm.
What is live
Much
anymore
there.
in this
Exactly.
story?
Exactly.
I kind of want to.
Yeah.
I kind of want to make another root pun before we go, but I'm drawing a blank.
God.
Jill, do you have another root pun for us?
That's okay.
You know what? We're all doing this Cup episode from Canada. Roots is a company,
Brand of
Canadian
clothing.
company.
Shout out to
And
Roots.
that's how you know it's the end of the night.
Hashtag
Yeah,
not sponsored.
Hashtag we are done.
That
Thank you,
comment
everybody.
was drier than my
Thank
wine.
you. Thank you again for having me.
Have a great
Enjoy
time,
your
everybody.
night.
We'll see you next week with Love's Labor's Lost. Thanks.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
All the best.